And spring did spring here a couple of days ago. So that says we're looking forward to even better times. And I do want to say thank you to Philip, and thank you. Thank you to Philip and Miss Jane and Brandy and the choir and fellows. Appreciate it very much. The title of the message this morning is Grace is Abundant and Free. Some of you may know or remember Deion Sanders was an athlete, multi-talented. He played professional baseball and professional football at the same time until he finally gave up baseball and just played for the Cowboys. I guess they paid him enough money finally. But he was a fairly wealthy fellow. Well, it so happened that one time one of his cousins just wrote him a letter asking him for money. Well, Sanders was known to be fairly generous, and he'd donated money and things of this nature before. But it kind of galled him a little bit that his cousin, whom he hadn't seen in years and years since they were small, would dare to write him and ask for money. So he sent back a little bit of a biting kind of letter, and he told him, he said, listen, he said, now, what I want you to do is take a little initiative of your own and get out there, and you can make this money yourself. Think about it. So he sent the letter to his cousin, and his cousin immediately sold it on eBay for $1,000. That was his initiative. Sometimes there's grace and we don't even know it. Grace. And you know, sometimes words take on a better understanding when we see them played out in real life, more so than when we hear them. You know, Jesus didn't always teach in a classroom type setting, like he did when he taught the Sermon on the Mount, classroom type setting. When he fed the 4,000, he taught them first for a good while until they were worn out and hungry. And then on the 5,000, the very same thing. Here he had a classroom type setting, and he was teaching people. He did that quite often. However, he also taught when he was walking from one place to another. People followed him, especially his disciples and his apostles. They followed him, and other people did as well. And people along the way, when he went through a town or near some place, villages or even those in the country, people would come out to see him and to hear him, at least for a little while. So he would teach anyone that was coming along. Now, the thing is, Jesus' best sermons on grace are not actually sermons as such. They're simply seen in the interaction that Jesus had with people as he was walking and traveling. And unlike most of us, Jesus was never, ever too preoccupied to not notice people that were standing around him. And not only did he see them, but he looked into their hearts. And he really saw them, and he saw their needs. That was Jesus. Now, our text today, in it, Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem, where within less than 2 weeks, he would die on the cross on the hill of Mount Calvary. Now, the two incidences that we want to look at today took place in and around Jericho as Jesus is on his way up to Jerusalem to die. Let's read. In Luke chapter 18, beginning with verse 35 through chapter 19, verse 10. As Jesus approached Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard the crowd coming by, he asked, "What's happening?" And they told him, "Jesus of Nazareth is passing by." And he called out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And those who led the way rebuked him, and they told him to be quiet. But he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stopped, and he ordered the man to be brought to him. And when he came near, Jesus asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" "Lord, I want to see," he replied. And Jesus said to him, "Receive your sight. Your faith has healed you." Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus, praising God. When all the people saw it, they also praised God. Moving on to chapter 19, verse 1, let's look at the other fellow. And Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was. But being a short man, not too short, being a short man, he could not because of the crowd. So he ran ahead and he climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. And when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and he said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this, and they began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I'll pay them back 4 times the amount." And Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save what was lost." As we read, Jesus took time to be gracious toward these two men. These two men that he saw at Jericho or roundabouts, as he was walking through there on his way to Jerusalem to die. First, Jesus showed grace to a beggar. A beggar! As Jesus walking down the road, talking with his disciples, teaching them, teaching everyone that would listen. And there was a good crowd following him. And a good crowd, so much so that some of them were going ahead of him, some of them were behind him, they were all around him. And as he's going, he kept walking, and he passed by a blind man sitting by the roadside begging. Now, that's not unusual. That's normal. Because you see, begging was a way of making a living in Israel for people who had all types of maladies. It was like, even today, you can drive into Washington, D.C., and you can't help it, but the very first traffic light that you come to, somebody's going to come up to your car and beg. They are going to be there, and they're going to have signs, and some of those signs will say, "Homeless, give me some money," or whatever, but they're going to be begging. And we'll see that. See it in Alexandria and Fairfax and everywhere else around there. I can remember I couldn't go anywhere near D.C. without running into these fellows, and they were always there wanting to beg. And of course, Clarice always rolled her window down and gave them a couple of dollars, and that was always the way it was. But the thing is they were begging. And so it was no surprise then for Jesus to go by, and here's this blind man. He'd probably passed several other people who were begging as well. But he's begging. What does he want? Well, everyone thinks a beggar, he wants a handout. He wants some money. That's what he wants. Now, when this beggar heard the noises of the crowd, he says, "Hey, what's happening?" And then he was told Jesus of Nazareth was passing through. Now, this man was blind, but he was not ignorant of what was going on in Israel. When we lived in Portsmouth, Virginia, we had two good friends. They had just moved there from over around Staunton, and they were both blind. And we spent a lot of time with them, and we went places together. And at first, when we first met them, probably the first time we went out with them somewhere, we found it kind of strange that people would come up to us and ask us questions about them when they were standing right there. They addressed it to us. And so that was kind of a shock and a surprise. But of course, they told us that, hey, this was nothing unusual. And usually what would happen is they would ask us the question, and Billy and Inez would answer. And that kind of shocked them. And Inez said, you know, it's a strange thing, but when people see us and they know that we're blind, they automatically think we can't hear either. But they could. They could. So here's this blind man, and he hears that Jesus of Nazareth is coming by. And let me tell you something. He knew what was going on in Israel, and he had already heard about Jesus of Nazareth. He had already heard, we know he had heard, because we're going to find out when we look at it a little carefully, that he knew about Jesus. And I can just imagine that the very first time that this man has heard about Jesus of Nazareth and the miracles that he is doing, that in the back of his mind, somehow he's thinking, boy, I wished I could see Jesus. I'd really like to see. So, here it comes. The man is passing by, or Jesus is passing by, and what does he do? He calls out. And here's how we know that that he had already known about Jesus, because what did he call him? He didn't say, "Hey, Jesus, hey, you prophet of Nazareth." He said, what? Son of David. And Son of David was the messianic, or a title for Jesus, a title for the one who was coming to save Israel. The prophets had already told about the Son of David who was coming again. And so this man is already believing and knows that what? That Jesus of Nazareth is the promised one of God. And so he calls out, Son of David. Now the first time he does it, what do the people do? Shh, shh, shh. Now don't think too harsh of the crowd, because what? The crowd is probably thinking in the back of their mind, oh, we're trying to listen to what Jesus is saying because it's important. And we want to know and we want to be taught. And he doesn't have time for some $50 donation. Somebody else can give you some money. Don't worry about that. They didn't understand. This man wasn't looking for a 50-cent handout. He wasn't even looking for a $1 handout. He wasn't interested in money when he heard that it was Jesus. He wanted something else. What did he want? What did he want? Now listen. The blind man really wasn't as blind as the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the teachers of the law. Because you see, he believed that Jesus was the Messiah. From what he had heard, he called him again, what? Son of David. son of David. Now, it seems quite expected that this beggar would be begging Jesus for something. But what did he want? What did he want? Now, listen, Jesus, he looked on this man's heart. He understood the man's need. He knew what he wanted. He didn't have to ask him, but he asked him, and that benefits us, and it benefited those people then, because they understood then, and we understand. What does this man want? And this man says it. I want to see. Now, I can just picture, again, here is this man for who knows how long, maybe a year or so, maybe a few months, however long, since he has heard about Jesus. And Jesus has been ministering now for 3 years by this time. He has been healing people. He has been healing blind people. He has been healing crippled people. He's been healing people of everything and anything. And here's the man thinking, hey, wouldn't it be nice if Jesus passed by? I know what I would ask for. And he did. Jesus stood him and said, come here. Stood him right there in front of him. And Jesus didn't mutter. Not like the crowds were muttering. He said it loud and clear so everyone could hear. What do you want? What do you want me to do for you? And listen, this guy wasn't shy at all. He said, I want to see. I want to see. And immediately, Jesus spoke, and he said, receive your sight. And the man did. Immediately. No waiting, no later. Immediately. Jesus dispensed some grace, real grace, on that man. That man who had possibly spent a lifetime sitting by the road and begging for a few copper coins. I want to see. Wow. And you know, I always think, I can't help but think of, hey, how much this man had anticipated this very moment. Almost too good to be true. And he received his sight. Wow. Right then came the moment of grace. Right then came the moment of mercy. Now, he was healed, and he could see. And when everyone saw what happened, they praised God. Yet something a bit more wonderful happened that very day with that very man. The once blind beggar began following Jesus. Now that's the response of grace. That's the response that Jesus expects. That's the response that God expects. When He pours out His grace upon us, He expects people to have a thankful heart. Be thankful. And this man was thankful. And he couldn't help but to follow Jesus. And the implication here is that this was not just some momentary or short-lived decision, but it was a permanent one. He was permanently going to follow Jesus. This man understood his need for grace, and he begged for it. And Jesus had mercy on him. And He poured out His grace upon him. Now, when someone really understands the full impact of receiving grace, they respond similarly. They commit themselves to Jesus Christ. Jesus showed grace to a beggar. He showed grace abundantly and free. Abundantly and free. He got his sight, and it didn't cost him anything. He didn't even have to do penance. So Jesus showed grace to a beggar, and he also showed grace to a tax collector. A tax collector. Now the kids know all about Zacchaeus because they sing about him being that wee little man who wanted to see Jesus and climbed the tree so that he could see Jesus. You know, we're given several facts about this man. Of course, first of all, he wanted to see Jesus, but he was a tax collector, and not just a tax collector, a chief tax collector. Matthew was a tax collector. This man was a chief tax collector, which meant Matthew may have worked for him. We don't know. But he did have several other tax collectors working under him for whom he was responsible. So he was a tax collector. Number two, he was also rich. Now, it doesn't tell us how he got his money. But hey, I can imagine that being a chief tax collector was a rather lucrative type of profession in those days. So he had money. And number three, he wanted to see Jesus. Not in the same way that we go and watch a parade or go and see a celebrity. He wanted to see Jesus. He wanted to see who Jesus was. Apparently, he too had heard about Jesus of Nazareth, the prophet. He wanted to see. And he wanted to see if possibly it was worthwhile pursuing this fellow anymore. I want to see who he is. And fourth, because he was short, and he was a short man, he couldn't see over the crowd, so he had to run ahead of them, climbed up a tree, a sycamore fig tree. Why? So he could get a better view of him when he passed that by. This way, he could really take and see what Jesus was about. And he could hear some of the things that Jesus was saying. Now, Zacchaeus wasn't expecting what happened. And what happened was Jesus looked up and saw him there. But it was more again than just seeing him with his eyes. He saw the longing that was in Zacchaeus' heart. He saw what Zacchaeus was really needing and what he wanted. He looked at Zacchaeus and he saw him. What did Zacchaeus want? Zacchaeus wanted some forgiveness. Zacchaeus wanted to be accepted. Because being a chief tax collector, he was rejected by almost everyone. The Romans didn't really respect him, and neither did the people. And all the riches and the money that he was getting didn't mean a thing. His heart was crying for Jesus. His heart was crying for forgiveness. And Jesus looked on his heart and he saw him just like he did with the blind man. And so what did Jesus do? He said, "Come on down here immediately." And then notice what happened. Jesus invited himself over to Zacchaeus' house. Now, it doesn't say necessarily that they went for a meal, but it seems that they did. Because why? Because later on they stood up, which means they had to have been laying down or sitting down. And what do you do when you sit down in somebody else's house? You eat. So he probably was over there for a meal, and he was talking, and he was teaching. And it doesn't say what he taught, and it doesn't say that even that he taught anything. And all of a sudden, we find that what? That Zacchaeus welcomed him gladly. Gladly. Now, This is called quiet stir with the good and the proper people in town. And they started muttering, "He's gone to be the guest of a sinner." As if Jesus had no idea who this man was. But Jesus knew exactly who Zacchaeus was, because he looked upon his heart. I like that word mutter. It reminds me of my mother-in-law, not because I called her Mutter, but it reminds me of her because she muttered sometimes. But her muttering was a loud whisper, and I always get that picture when I see this. They're muttering out there of her. We were in Jarvisburg, North Carolina, first ministry I had. She came and she was visiting us there, and she was sitting toward the back with Clarice and Tammy and Danny. And when some young kids who were sitting a few pews in front of them began making a little bit of commotion and all, and apparently she had observed them for a little while, she muttered, just about like the crowd did, "Those kids are the meanest kids I've ever seen." Well, at the time for Clarice and the rest of us, it was an embarrassing moment. But ever since then, we get to laugh at it. We get to laugh about it. I can just hear those good citizens muttering, "Hey, Jude, did you hear that Jesus is going to be the guest of sinners at that sinner's house? And they say he's a prophet? Ha, no way." Now, again, it doesn't tell us what Jesus said to Zacchaeus and to those who were present in the house. It only tells us the results. And apparently now, Jesus didn't tell him what he told the rich young ruler. Remember the rich young ruler? What did Jesus say? He said, "Listen, you're a nice rich young fella. You've done all these wonderful things. You've followed the law and everything else, but you lack one thing. Sell everything you have and give it to the poor and come and follow me." Well, Jesus apparently didn't tell Zacchaeus those words. But whatever it was that Jesus said, Zacchaeus stood up on his own without anyone asking him or anything else, and he said, "Everything I own, half of it, I'm going to give to the poor. And if I've cheated anybody out of anything in regard to taxes or anything else, I'm going to pay him back 4 times the amount." Now, he may have been rich, but if he had been much of a cheater, he was going to be poor. But it didn't matter. All the money didn't matter anymore. Getting ahead didn't matter anymore. All of that pushing and pushing didn't matter anymore. None of it mattered. None of it. Except Jesus. Jesus. Now, it doesn't say anything about him following Jesus. But Jesus did say that today salvation has come to this house. Why? Because this man is truly a man of faith. He is a son of Abraham. And Jesus didn't mutter. He said it clearly to everyone who was within earshot, so everyone could hear and know. Even those curious idlers who were standing around on the outside waiting to see what would happen. And what did happen? Grace. Grace abundantly and free for who? For a chief tax collector. A chief tax collector receiving grace? Impossible. Not hardly. Remember what Jesus said about the 2 men praying in the parables? It was the tax collector who went away justified